means of looking at something, they've had within their grasp the means of looking at something as being a difference between wavelength and frequency. But they don't see it that way because of the way they map it out. But there are those four items, and they're all really can be seen as waveforms affecting a waveform. In other words, when a waveform affects a waveform, you get the interference pattern. In other words, you have, in terms of standard trigonometry, you've got the three primary functions and their co-functions. And they try to come up with inverse functions that describe what's going on the other side of the coin. But in fact, what we really have is one view that's going to see three functions and their co-functions, and another view that's going to see four functions and their co-functions. And that's always going to be the existent state in terms of our perception, because we've got to stand someplace. We can see four things out there and three things in here, or we can see four things in here and three things out there. We cannot ourselves perceive four inside and four outside at the same time because there's nowhere to stand. When we have the four quadranometric functions of mental relativity, and we affect those with four functions, four waveforms that would adjust the amplitude, frequency, phasing, and vertical placement, vertical disposition. That's going to have a complete map, create a complete map of all that can be perceived, because we're going to see the four dimensions that we're looking at, and we're going to see the effect of four other dimensions that we can't look at. And that creates, again, a binary. So the relationship between the four that we can see and the four that we can only feel the impact of, that creates the first binary, which then will begin the first rung of the first of the two double helixes, double heli. Anyway, so in looking at mass, we're looking at whether something exists or doesn't exist. That's the only place where we actually see the true binary state, is at the level of mass. And it's the farthest thing away from the concepts of mental relativity. But the keynote here is to say that when we can go through the complete cycle of looking at all four dimensions that we can see, from all four points of view we can take to look at them, and we can go through them in all possible orders that we can cycle through that, we have then examined the issue from every direction and every sequence that we can take. And when we have, if we perceive in whatever we're looking at, internally or externally, we either perceive it internally as knowledge or externally as mass, because it has not changed. So therein is a definition of mass, meaning that mass cannot be defined externally alone. Mass can only be defined in terms of the relationship between the observer and the observation, that which is observed. In other words, there is no such thing as mass completely independent of the person, of the observer. Now, if that's the case, what is there? Well, there are waveforms. There are waveforms that exist. But those waveforms that exist, again, are only seen as waveforms when you begin to look at things in terms of energy. And energy is going to be something in which you perceive a repetitive change during the course of consideration. In other words, if you're looking at something that appeared at first to be mass, but now you're noticing that the mass is greater or less or differently arranged. No, not arranged, just greater or less. I'm getting off into space already. But if you look at at the object internally or externally as beginning to change, you sense then an increase or decrease in that mass. And that increase or decrease in the mass is going to describe a waveform, because you'll see it cycling. Now, let's step back for a minute. This is all happening as I'm thinking of it here. When you see it cycle, it appears to be energy, but when you see it going linearly, as opposed to being a waveform, then you perceive it as space. So inside, when you see something cycling, you perceive it as thought. And when you see something increasing or decreasing in a linear pattern or non-cycling pattern, you perceive it as internally ability or externally space. Now that means that if you look at the trigonometric equations, the functions, you're going to find that they don't even have one in the functions that appears to be mass. Because if you look at sine wave, if you look at cosine, those are the two functions together that are going to determine a sense of energy or a sense of thought. And the reason they're going to determine that is because you can see them cycling repetitively. And when you see them cycling repetitively, then you're going to perceive those as either entropy or extropy. And the sine wave would be extropy, and the cosine wave would be entropy. So, sine and cosine. Okay, now you get down to tangent and cotangent, and there is that curve in it. And when you're considering space or ability, you're going to see it as a linearity. Now, it could very well be that tangent and cotangent might be what describe space for us, because even though they have that little jolt in the middle, they're pretty linear. That might be the case. I'm not sure. And then I suppose we would have to look at time as being secant and cosecant. But we still don't have anything that really describes mass. And that's interesting, because mass is a concept that drives external male science, and yet it's the one concept they haven't addressed in trigonometry. The function of a straight line does not exist when you're cycling around a circle. Pi cannot coexist in a universe with linearity. And that's quite right. But rather than being able to put it all together and see it all at one time, they've separated out the geometry from the trigonometry, and you end up with, when you're dealing with trig, not being able to create a straight line. Now, all these pieces go together to create that unified field theory. I think I really have it here, and don't have the vision of what it is I've got, but I think I've already got it. Essentially, a way to look at the bridge between particle and wave is to look at interference patterns. And if we do that, we can describe in interference patterns that are seen over time, as opposed to interference patterns that are seen only at a single slice of time, a single moment. So when we look at an interference pattern that changes over time, that's when we're going to have the translation between particle and wave, because it contains both particle and wave nature. In other words, as we watch standing waves over a period of consideration that remain in position and do not change in height or in amplitude or in phase or anything else, that they're just there. Those appear to be mass or knowledge. And when we see items that are changing in a linear pattern, non-repetitive, we see those as peaks that are lowering, and they just continue lowering and lowering, or growing and growing, troughs that continue to grow. We see a directionality that's linear, then we're going to perceive that as space or ability. And when we see patterns that undulate in these standing waves, so in other words, there's waveforms upon the waveform, that undulation that is repetitive will be seen as energy. In other words, when in this complex synthesis that creates the interference pattern, we see a repetitive waveform upon it, so that things are moving in a constantly repeating manner without any change in the repetition from cycle to cycle. We perceive that as energy or as thought. And when we look at something that is actually altering its nature so that it becomes a complex waveform because it's changing, it's phasing, or its amplitude, again, we're going to look at it changing. We're going to look at time as a synthesis of mass, energy, and space. Those are the three we'll be able to look at, and time itself will only be looking at the impact of the three others. We cannot see it directly because time is where we're looking at things from. And that is why we are all locked in, ultimately, into seeing the universe in only three items and imagining time. That is why we're ultimately locked into seeing E equals mc squared when we're looking externally, is because the sense of the flow of time is the synthesis that we allow ourselves to say, what else is going on? We lump it all together. And in fact, that concept of time contains infinity within it, because it has within it all of the other dimensions that would be at work beyond the three we perceive, lumped in together into the single dimension of time. It's a mutt. It's a mixed breed. It's not, time is not a pure item. Time is what we call everything else. Time is what we call all that is left over once we remove energy, mass, and space. It's the remainder. And anything that remains after removing those three dimensions we call time. So the nature of time changes depending on how many dimensions are at work in a particular scenario. If there's only one dimension at work, we see time very purely. If there's 100 different dimensions at work beyond the three in which we're normally perceiving, then time becomes very impure and very chaotic. And therefore there is a sliding scale from a predictive time to a non-predictive time, depending on how many dimensions are at play. And that then determines the extent of chaos, the scope of chaos. So all of the pieces are there, and it does have the recursive nature, because we'll be looking externally to view things, but have to monitor the cycle of our own mind. If we hold the cycle of our own mind as constant, then that means that we're looking at ourselves as only having four dimensions. And as such, we have a predictable cycle, which then becomes a constant, which is again, we perceive, looking at an issue from all the sides that we see it, as being a temporal endeavor where we are considering it or pondering it for a period of time. This is what we're doing, but it feels to us, in terms of our sense of self, our self-awareness, as that's the size of our mind. That's how deeply we can consider the issue. So we string ourselves along, point by point, in a sequential progression, which is actually built of quads that we circle around, we spiral through, but we still have a temporal progression. And in this temporal progression, once we've completed looking at all four dimensions from all 4 points of view and all the different sequences through which we might examine the relationship between the two, creating the relationships between the two in all of the different orders we can, then at that point we have arrived at one complete cycle of consideration, which is the same for any human being. As a result of it, that leads us to the concept that, or to the view that we have had a full cycle of consideration, and that becomes the size of our mind. Now, is it really the same for every human being? I just said that. But is it? Well, it only is insofar as we look at people all the time and say, how deeply do you consider an issue? The more you think about it, which has two different ramifications. How much of your mind is brought to bear on the issue? Are you doing parallel processing where you're thinking of 3 or 4 different things at once, or are you completely focusing your mind on the one issue at hand? That's the spatial nature of it. And the temporal nature is, how long are you going to mull it around to monitor what's changing? Because you will see things changing. And the things that are changing, if you monitor long enough, you'll see more things changing. If your baseline increases of consideration, you'll see more things happening. Less things will be conceived of as knowledge, and more things will be conceived of as thought. This is what's going to happen when you extend or diminish the baseline by which you consider. And if you look at things externally, you get a sense of geologic time, a sense of human lifespan time, a sense of historic time. You can see that some things that are considered unchanging become changing with longer baselines by which to measure them. And so the real notion, as I mentioned before, about time being the amalgam of everything that's left over, the amalgam of all of the remaining dimensions, that essence of time is going to contain more or fewer dimensions depending upon the baseline of consideration. Meaning that how many cycles do we go through of our mind in considering an issue? Now, if nothing changes over one cycle, it is clearly mass. Now, if we go through one cycle, what happens when we go through 2 cycles of consideration and we see some change? If we're going through 2 cycles, we're going to perceive it as energy. We perceive it as energy because we see it not changing for one cycle, and then we see changes occur during the second cycle, and we see that something has acted upon it. Something has acted upon it. Now in 3 cycles, we see not only has something acted upon it, but we get a sense of the impact of that. We triangulate on it. And when we triangulate on it by getting 3 cycles of view, one of what it was, one of what it's changed to, and then whether the change is linear or not, which is the 3rd cycle, because we'll see if it's continuing in the same direction, that's what defines our sense of space. And when we go through the 4th cycle of mind, that's what gives us our sense of time, which is not only has it shifted position, which is 1st cycle to 2nd cycle, but has it shifted position as part of a process or part of a state being moved, being acted upon. That's what gives us our 3rd cycle, by giving us, instead of 2 points, which do not indicate that there is a vector at work, it only indicates that a shift has occurred. And when we put the vector at work, then we see the spatial aspect. Now, I may be wrong about that. It may be that, in fact, when we see a point and we see a change in that point, that we perceive that as space in the second cycle, and in the third cycle we perceive energy. That could very well be by seeing if a vector is at work. But clearly, one cycle will give us mass, and this is when we run into the blending that we go into that causes a problem with what happens in Act 2, is when I look at 2 and 3 spatially, trying to look at them spatially, then I say, what do we learn next? And do we learn something that's spatial or something temporal? That may indeed be where the flip is between male and female perspectives. The temporal brain operating system and the spatial brain operating system is that the order is going to be different, so that one goes from mass to space to energy to time, and the other one goes from mass to energy to space to time. As a matter of fact, I think that's probably the case. And because that's the case, I think that we probably define a particle as something that goes mass, space, energy, time. And we would describe a wave as something that goes mass, no, I'm sorry, did I say it wrong? Space would be, particle would be mass, space, energy, time. Wave would be mass, energy, space, time. That would be a definition of particle and wave. Boy, I really got that screwed up. Can't imagine, with all these little things floating around, I'd get anything screwed up. But if we want to look at particle, we're going to look at mass, space, energy, time. If we're going to look at wave, we're going to look at mass, energy, space, time. There, that's correct. Now, when we go through the fourth cycle finally, then we can see if there is a change in the vector. We can see if not only was there something there, which was cycle 1, that did not change, was there something there that was not changing? Can we call it an object? Number 2, cycle 2. Has that object changed in any manner since our first consideration of it? And when we look at that, go through the second cycle of consideration, then we say, yes, there has been a shift or a change in that object. Cycle 3 is going to say, is that change continuing? And we will have an indication of that by cycle 3 is, yes, the change is continuing. But because we cannot tell where between cycle 1 and cycle 2 the change actually began to occur, all we can do is perceive that with the phasing of the observation in relationship to our act of observing, the phasing of the object, that between the first observation and the second, when we notice change, did it begin just before the second observation, or did it begin just after the first observation, which is going to have a big determination as to whether it is a linear change or a logarithmic change. So when we're looking at that, that would be cycle 3 would finally determine, okay, this thing is changing in a linear pattern, or this thing is changing so far unpredictably. And when we look at cycle 4 is going to give us our sense of time to see if there's any change in the pattern of change. And when we look at that, see if there's any acceleration or deacceleration in change, that is when we determine waveform. That is when we determine what kind of a wave. We determine the frequency, we determine the amplitude, we determine the phase, and all of those things have come together finally. And the last thing we get out of it is we get frequency. And so, all of the pieces are there, again. And it's a matter of putting it into the formula. But we don't need any more information, because we could follow all the way through. From particle to wave, we can follow all the way through from a space sense to a time sense of looking at things. We can follow all the way through from the internal to the external view. We can follow all the way through from the subjective to the objective, or the objective to the subjective. So it's all in place now, and I hope within the next few months to the end of this year, at good old Screenplay Systems, George and Mark and I will be able to zero in on the exact mathematical description of how all these pieces fit together, and that will be a formula for unified field. Okay, it's about 1:45 in the morning on July 6th, and Mindy and I just kind of worked out an idea that'll be useful for alter ego. The concept is, what does it feel like to be getting close to a problem you don't want to address, and why would you not want to address it? Well, the reason you wouldn't want to address the problem is because it's something that you know if you have to face it, it's going to require making a decision that will entail some loss or some costs. In other words, at this particular point in time, if you address that issue, there will be losses attached. Either way, if you decide to solve the problem one way, you will suffer certain losses. If you decide to not to solve the problem, you have the losses of remaining with the inequity. So the two choices are, do you address it or do you not address it? And the point is that once you've considered it, once you've thought of it, once you have defined what the problem is, you're forced into making a choice of either addressing it or not. One thing you can't do is forget about it. Not easily, anyway. So that's how you can tell when you're arriving at the actual heart of the matter. The way that you can tell if you're beginning to get right down to what the problem is that you have something that you have thought of that you wish you could forget because you don't want to address it. That has no logic to it, and in fact you'll find the reason starts to go crazy because it becomes completely chaotic. Everything it looks at does not make sense. That's because the decision has to be arrived at emotionally as to which one you want more. And if you're right on the crux, where it's not just, I want this and I want that and I can't decide between them, but if it's actually a situation where you say, I want this, but it has costs attached to it. I want this other thing and it has costs attached to it. And the amount that I want one compared to the cost that I have to pay, compared to the amount that I want the other compared to the cost that I have to pay, make neither choice satisfactory. Therefore, you're going to be stuck in a true dilemma where it doesn't matter what you do, you cannot win because you're going to be dissatisfied or unfulfilled no matter which one you choose. Now, in time, that can change. And therefore, if you start considering the problem or even being aware of the problem too soon, you're not going to be able to deal with it, and you keep hoping that the situation will change in time. So you put it off and you put it off and you put it off, waiting for new information. But eventually you reach a point where you realize that new information has been coming in and coming in and coming in, and none of it has given you any alteration of the nature of the two wants with their two attendant costs. In other words, the balance keeps coming out the same way time and time again. All you can judge from that is that even though things could change, the cycle in which change could occur is longer than the amount of time in which you can endure justifying away your knowledge of the existence of the problem. In other words, the pain of not deciding between the two is created in an equity that is greater than your ability to overcome it for any longer because you've seen no progress in getting closer to finding which one of the two alternatives is better, because there's been no change in the balance between them and their attendant costs and each other. It becomes a complex web then. That means you are faced with a leap of faith. You are faced with an option lock. That's what brings an option lock to a conclusion, is that you can no longer endure the search for further information because you have not been picking up clues. If you're out looking in the various options you have and you find here is something that might be useful and here is something that might be useful and here is something that might be useful, you can hold out hope to be able to ultimately take these useful bits of information you found and put them together into some kind of pattern that would resolve the problem for you. But if you've gone into each place and looked at all the information available, thinking things might be useful, tried them and found out indeed they're not useful information at all, then after a while you found that you haven't gotten any useful information. You've been denied at every turn to find the tools that you need to create a new holism, to resolve this problem. And because you can't find anything to leverage the situation, you can't find anything that will be the key to create the force that's needed to rearrange all in one moment, one magic moment, from one binary state of things to the next, one arrangement of things to another arrangement. After a while, the inequity within you builds that since there's been no progress towards getting the requirements or even prerequisites necessary to meet the requirement to achieve the goal of switching from one binary state to another, resolving the issue between